All right, welcome to our daily read aloud. We are reading I Survived the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, and we are ready for chapter 12. Okay, someone give me a quick recap. We know that Oscar went and found the orphans. They were living alone. Their house was burned down, and they've escaped. They were in an alley, and someone came up to them, and they have some trouble brewing. Angie?
Otis. And I was shocked of what. So turns out he said, "Come on, Jenny," and then no one quits. So I think Jenny was part of their team, and Jenny just figured out that he saw the same exact boys' suitcases because Oscar was right there next to him.
Okay, yeah, so they ran into Otis, and he is the leader of the kid gang. And he said, "Oh, you think you're getting your suitcases back?" And that's right when Jenny realized, "Oh, that's the boy I stole the suitcases from, and now he's helping us." So she feels bad. Madeline?
Then he punched him.
Yes. So Otis had a knife, and he was going after Oscar's neck. And right before he did that, he punched Oscar in the face. And that is about where we ended. So let me go back and reread that last part from chapter 11. Okay, so Otis reached in his jacket and pulled out a huge knife. Jenny staggered back, and Bruno went running into her arms. But it wasn't Jenny whom Otis came at with the knife. It was Oscar. Otis sprang forward and placed the blade against Oscar's cheek. Oscar closed his eyes, bracing himself for the slicing metal. But it was Otis's other hand that came swinging up. Smack! His rock-like fist smashed into Oscar's nose. Oscar fell to the ground, the flash of pain in his head burning brighter than the blazing sky. Chapter 12. Oscar had no idea how long he lay in the alley, dead to the world. When the blackness started to lift from his mind, all he could feel was pain. His nose seemed crushed, his brain knocked loose. Where was he? All he knew was that something terrible had happened to him. Had he been kicked by one of the horses? Had he fallen from the roof of the barn? He smelled smoke. Was the prairie on fire again? And where was Mama? But then pictures flashed through his throbbing skull. Glittering yellow eyes, the flash of a knife blade, a little girl with raggedy braids. And then his eyelids shot open. Jenny, Bruno! He sat up and looked around, fighting back tears. They were gone. Otis Weber had taken both of them. Oscar struggled to breathe. And now it was his panic and not the smoke that choked his lungs. He struggled to stand up, wobbling as he found his balance. Jenny, he cried. Bruno! The words came out as a rasping whisper. But he called their names again and again as he staggered down the alley, past the water barrel, and back out into the street. On the street were dozens of people fleeing north, pushing their carts and wheelbarrows and hauling their sacks. The sparks and embers rained down. Nobody noticed the boy with the blood-smeared face and swollen eyes, frantically searching the crowd. Part of Oscar wanted to go back into the alley, to curl up. Maybe the wind would sweep him up and carry him back to Castle, to anywhere but here. But even in his dazed and muddled state, he knew he would not do that. He had to get to the Palmer house to find Mama. Yes?
What's Castle?
That's the town he used to live in. He had to get back to the Palmer Hotel to find Mama and Mr. Morrow. If anyone could find Jenny and Bruno, it was Mr. Morrow. He remembered that Jenny said they were just 1 block away from the hotel. He ran back into the alley and then cut through a side street 1 block. He came out on a wide avenue, and there it was, the Palmer House Hotel. The massive building was in flames. The roof had caved in, and piles of crumbled marble and wood lay in heaps in the street. The fire must have been burning for hours. Mama and Mr. Morrow couldn't possibly still be here. Fire gushed out of the hotel's windows. Black smoke churned through the roof. But it wasn't the sight of the burning Palmer house that turned Oscar's insides to jelly. It was what he saw when he turned and looked up the street. It was a gigantic wave of fire. It was wider than the street, with flames towering hundreds of feet into the air. It looked like the sun had burst open, and its fiery blood was gushing into the city. Oscar understood what was happening, because the same thing had happened during the castle fire. Smaller fires joined together into one monstrous blaze. Oscar and Mama had heard the terrifying stories from people who had witnessed the fire up close and barely escaped with their lives. They described a fire so big that it seemed to stretch forever across the prairie, and so high it seemed to be trying to roast the moon. It raced across the prairie faster than a horse could gallop. One man swore that a tornado of fire appeared out of nowhere and lifted his house off the ground. These stories haunted Oscar for months. He'd wake up at night soaked in sweat, convinced his house was burning. Walking home from school, he'd keep his eyes peeled and aimed at the sky, convinced that a flaming twister was going to carry him away. And now those nightmares were coming true. The wall of fire roared down the street, devouring everything in its path. The wind gusted, a hot and poisonous blast that almost knocked Oscar off his feet. Oscar watched in horror as a blazing sheet peeled off the fire. It swirled through the air, a flaming twister bigger and more horrifying than anything Oscar could have imagined. It flew down the street, hundreds of yards. Boom! It exploded into a tall building, igniting it. Now the street was blocked on both sides, with the flames spreading fast. Oscar stood there, frozen in fear. He had no idea what to do, where to go. But then he heard someone calling his name. Oscar! It rose up above the fire's lion roar, like a kindly giant calling from his castle in the sky. Oscar whirled around. A shadow appeared through the cloud of smoke. He saw a familiar face, and he let himself fall into the strong arms that reached out for him. It was Mr. Morrow. Chapter 13. Your mother is safe at my house, Mr. Morrow shouted over the roaring fire. One of Mr. Morrow's friends had taken Mama there in a buggy hours before. My house is far to the north, he said. The flames won't reach there. She didn't want to leave the hotel, but I promised her that I would find you. He explained this as they ran to the corner. The streets were practically deserted. Almost everyone else on the block had already fled. Mr. Morrow had stayed behind, risking his life to look for Oscar. Oscar opened his mouth to thank him, to tell him about Jenny and Bruno. But his voice was wrecked from the smoke and his shouting, and he didn't know how to begin. A cab stood at the corner, the horse covered with a soaking wet blanket to protect it from the sparks. A familiar voice shouted to them through the smoke. Got him, Charlie? It was Joseph, the cab driver Oscar had met earlier. I do, Mr. Morrow called. Mr. Morrow's got half the city of Chicago looking for you, son, Joseph said as they climbed in. Seconds later, they were inside the buggy, and the horse took off in a gallop. The two walls of flame were moving toward each other, but Joseph steered his horse through the middle and then swerved onto a side street that the fire hadn't yet touched. Most horses would have refused to budge in a fire like this, or would be rearing up in wild panic. But the old nag was calm, and Joseph barely had to snap the reins to keep her moving quickly. Joseph is taking us to the nearest bridge, Mr. Morrow said. We'll cross the river there and make our way to my house. There are fires on the either side, but nothing like this. Mr. Morrow shook his head. I can't believe it, Oscar, he said. So much is gone. The courthouse was in ruins, Mr. Morrow said. So were the new opera house, the grand department stores, and the huge factories and train depots. Thousands of houses were gone. I don't know what will be left when all this is over, Mr. Morrow said. The bridge came into view. It was wide, with a roadway in the center and two narrow walkways on either side. Oscar's heart sank as he saw the hundreds of people knotted together on the bridge, the dozens of buggies creeping along. Charlie, Joseph said, you're better off on foot, and I need to get up to my sister's house to check on her. Of course, Mr. Morrow said. He and Oscar climbed out, and Mr. Morrow reached up to shake hands with Joseph. Thanks. I'll see you, friend, Mr. Morrow said. You sure will, Joseph said. But Oscar could see the doubt in both men's eyes. What are they doubting? What can he see on their face? Cadence?
Maybe not going to see him again.
Yeah, maybe not. Why would they maybe not see each other? Abby?
Because maybe the fire will get them.
Yeah. Madeline?
Or maybe there could have been another factory somewhere and it could explode.
Okay, so there's just still a lot of danger. They don't know for sure what's going to happen. All right. They were standing in front of a paint warehouse, and Mr. Morrow looked at the bridge. His face was etched with worry. I don't like the look of that bridge, he said. The roadway is made of wood. It could burn at any time. If the fire comes, all those people will be trapped. It will be complete panic. Oscar remembered the horror of being stuck in the stampeding crowd with Jenny and Bruno. He knew Mr. Morrow was right, that the bridge was unsafe. But how else could they get across the river? He looked out on the water. Farther up were boats steaming and sailing in both directions, but this stretch was mostly empty. There, Mr. Morrow said, spotting a rowboat tied up along the riverbank. I used to row across all the time when I was a kid. It takes just a few minutes. They hurried to the boat. Climb in, Mr. Morrow said. I'm going to see if I can find another set of oars. It was only when Oscar got into the boat that he realized his whole body was shaking, but the thought of seeing Mama made him feel stronger. Here, Mr. Morrow said, handing Oscar a set of oars. We're going to have to move very quickly. Soon they'd shoved off and were rowing with all their might. Oil fumes rose up and something worse, that slaughterhouse stench. Garbage and dead rats floated around them. With so many factories lining the shores, Oscar knew that the water must be a filthy witch's brew. The wind blew hard, sending showers of sparks over the river. Shouts and screams rang out from the bridge. Oscar saw that a wagon in the middle of the bridge roadway had caught fire. Oscar closed his eyes and tried to block out the screams. Next came splashes, and Oscar refused to think about what or who was falling off the bridge and into the river. He looked in the other direction and gasped in horror. A large sailboat was racing through the water. The mast was burning. There was nobody at the helm. It looked like a ghost ship, evil and glowing, and it was heading right for them. Chapter 14. Row faster, Oscar, Mr. Morrow shouted. But the flaming boat was too big and moving too quickly for them to get out of the way in time. Oscar, Mr. Morrow said, can you swim? Yes, Oscar said. Good, he said, swim to shore. When you get to the other side, get yourself to the lake shore. Why was Mr. Morrow telling him this? But there was no time to ask. The burning ship was closing in. Jump, Mr. Morrow cried. Oscar threw himself over the side. The cold water slapped him and burned his skin. He started swimming as fast as he could, keeping his eyes and mouth closed against the foul water. Crash! Sparks flew up all around as the flaming ship hit the rowboat, slicing it in half and setting it on fire. Oscar kept swimming. He glanced over his shoulder, expecting to see Mr. Morrow right beside him, but he wasn't. Oscar stopped and turned, churning his legs and arms to stay afloat. Through the smoke, he saw something bobbing in the water. It was Mr. Morrow, clinging to a small piece of wood and struggling to keep his head above water. Now Oscar understood why Mr. Morrow didn't think he could make it to the other side of the river. He couldn't swim. Oscar should have known. Papa couldn't swim either, even though he grew up near the ocean. Mama was one of the few people Oscar knew who could swim, and it was she who had taught Oscar. Keep going, Oscar, Mr. Morrow cried. Oscar saw a huge piece of wood floating near him. He grabbed it and kicked as hard as he could to get to Mr. Morrow. Mr. Morrow, grab hold! Mr. Morrow looked up in surprise and relief as Oscar thrust the wood toward him. And that's when Oscar noticed that back on the south shore, from where they'd just escaped, the roof of the paint warehouse had caught fire. His heart leaped into his throat. Any minute, there would be a massive explosion. His paint is very flammable. They had to get away now. They both clung to the makeshift raft, kicking frantically, and then, kaboom! Behind them, the paint factory exploded with a deafening blast. Oscar waited for the crush of burning wood, for flames to reach out and grab them. But instead, the force of the explosion created a wave that came up behind them. It propelled them forward, out of the fire's reach, toward the safety of the North Shore. They landed with a thud on the muddy riverbank. Oscar looked back, amazed to see that the river itself was now on fire. He could barely believe they'd made it, yet he felt little relief. Oscar stared over the flaming river. The entire south side of the city was in the grip of fire and smoke, and somewhere in the middle of it all were Jenny and Bruno. Oscar told Mr. Morrow all about them as they trudged away from the river. Mr. Morrow listened closely. and Oscar sensed that he was using Oscar's words to paint a picture of Bruno and Jenny in his mind. "We'll find them, Oscar," he kept saying. "I found you, didn't I?" But the search for Jenny and Bruno would have to wait, because once again Oscar and Mr. Morrow found themselves in a fight for their lives. They kept trying to get back to Mr. Morrow's house, but the wind grew stronger and stronger, sweeping ferocious fires all through the north side of the river. Entire blocks burned within minutes. Flames chased after Oscar and Mr. Morrow. Each time they thought they were safe, a new fire would erupt, and they were on the run again. Their last hope was Lake Michigan, which stretched out to the east of the city. As the fires closed in behind them, they waded into the freezing water, ready to dunk under if the flames attacked. There were hundreds of people all around them, and the crowd grew to the thousands as the night wore on. There were entire families with their horses and with their wagons piled high with furniture, fancy ladies in their ruffled dresses and jewels, children who had been separated from their parents. They all stood gasping in the smoky air, shivering in the freezing water. The hours crept by, the sun came up, and still the fires raged out of control. It would be another endless day before finally the fires began to tire, when the winds lost their fury, when it was finally safe enough to wade out of the freezing water. It took hours more for Oscar and Mr. Morrow to make their way back to his house in the pouring rain. They were numb with cold and shock, miserable with thirst, and wheezing in the smoky air. But finally, they made it to Mr. Morrow's stone house, one of the few houses still standing. And there on the porch was Mama. Oscar got the idea that she'd been standing there for days. She sprinted off the porch and into the drenching rain to meet them. Her face was as pale as a bone. Oscar ran to her, throwing himself into her arms. They fell to their knees, their tears mixing with the raindrops that put out the last flickering flames of Chicago's fire. All right, and that is where we have to stop today. All right. So, just by a raise of hands, okay, here are your choices. Do you think Oscar is still going to try to find Jenny and Bruno, or do you think he's going to give up because there's no hope? All right, if you think he's going to keep looking, raise your hand. All right, that's most of you, almost all of you. All right, friends at home, most of us think he's going to keep looking. We'll see you soon.
Why do we have to stop so shortly?